Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Noz Urbina, and this is Omnichannel X's Omnichannel Podcast. Omnichannel X is brought to you by Urbina Consulting. Omnichannel X is our international learning portal where we host the thought leaders and case studies we think will be most helpful for content-rich organizations trying to build better relationships across all touchpoints. Now, enjoy the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Omnichannel Podcast by Omnichannel X and Urbina Consulting. My name is Noz Urbina. I'm here with Larry Swanson, who has an extensive background in all things content, and we have lots of questions for him. I'm very excited to have him here. Larry, you want to say hi to the group?
Hey, welcome. Happy to be here. Thanks for the warm welcome, and looking forward to talking.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to jump in. We're going to talk. Larry's got a diverse, as I said, diverse set of arrows in his quiver, and has worked in many aspects of content. But we're talking this year a lot about content modeling. We've got the content modeling series going, and it's kind of an evergreen topic. I've been talking about content modeling my whole career, so that's like the dot-com boom, kind of 23 years we've been discussing content modeling, structuring content. Now we're talking about all sorts of variations like knowledge graphs and domain modeling and ontologies. And so Larry knows a lot about all this. So that's going to be the main focus, but we're also going to bring in a lot of headless CMS. So in the age of headless CMS, which is such a hot buzzword and very popular with IT departments and teams around the world, how do all these things come together in an enterprise rollout where you have all these things possibly mix in one environment? So Larry, let's start off by talking. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, what kind of projects you've been on, and what kind of roles you've had in those projects?
Well, I'll try to be brief. I've been doing this a long time. I go back to I was browsing the internet before there was a web in the late 80s and early 90s, and old command line interfaces and CompuServe and all that old stuff. And then early on, I was working in book publishing at the time. So I've been a content person since the late 80s, early 90s. And even then I was exposed to like a headless CMS in the sense of like there were these SGML-based systems that handled the manuscripts I was acquiring and putting into production. So kind of been around this stuff for a long time. And even during my publishing career, I was really interested in technology. I was always the guy teaching the computer class or showing how to use email or something like that. But as soon as the internet came along, like the mid 90s, I left book publishing, did about 3 internet startups, kind of the mid to late 90s, early 2000s. Then got into SEO consulting, which was largely about content. And all those startups I did, they weren't the cool like platform things that make you a millionaire. They were like crummy little publishing projects that make you poor your whole life, which is fine. I love content that much. And so anyhow, then got into a lot of SEO and sort of like internet marketing consultations with folks. And a lot of what I now realize in retrospect, that was content strategy consulting even back then. I just didn't have the word to call it that. Went from there, I did some of my own publications. I launched, as an entrepreneur, launched a few things in the kind of mid to late 2000s era. And then about 8 or 10 years ago, I decided that I was kind of done being a publisher. I was much more identifying as a UX and human-centered design practitioner. And so I sort of shifted my identity from publisher to kind of from a pushy publisher, like giving you stuff, to like a curious designer going like, hey, what do you need? How can I help you? Which is why and so that's, and the culmination of that is the last few years, I've really got into like service design, omnichannel strategy, metadata strategy, all the skills and tools that you need to take all this kind of crazy new decoupled, multi-channeled, multifaceted, multi-device content and put it together in a way that helps those poor users.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to jump in there and mention SGML because you dropped a four-letter one in there. So that was a way that we were structuring content, pre-dot-com boom. There's many projects that lasted well into the 2000 and somethings. It's rare to see an SGML implementation these days, but it's very interesting because there was a period where people were thinking, oh well, how could you possibly still be relevant? If you were working on projects way back in the yonk days before we invented all the cool stuff. And what's interesting, what's happening is we're coming full circle, because in the early days of the internet, we were doing everything. There was no rules. There's nothing was mainstream yet. There were no streams. And so we were doing all sorts of things. So structuring content and trying to do multi-format and intelligent content, what we now call the semantic web. All that stuff goes back 30 years, even to the pre-web days. What we're seeing is we ran with what was easy, creating web pages. That was easy. Everybody could do it. We just take pages and throw them up there. We put in like a word processor type interface. We could create pages. And now we've created this mess for ourselves where there's too much spotty stuff and nobody can find anything. I was actually thinking about this recently. I remember when the iPhone came out, we were all so excited. There was the phrase, "There's an app for that." Remember that?
Oh, I had forgotten that phrase, but you're right.
Exactly. Because back we were going, oh man, there's an app for that. We're all excited to discover the new apps. And now we go, oh crap, there's a freaking app I have to download. So we've gone from the excitement of, oh wow, we can have web pages, to oh no, there's so many web pages. And so now we're coming back to organizing all this stuff, structuring it, making it filterable, leverageable, so that we can get away from having to deal with pages and start to deal with knowledge and answers and accessible value, which moves me along my journey. So for me, all of us who have go back 20 plus years in the web are bringing a very narrow, was a very small community who have that kind of experience in how to manage something that isn't web pages. So I'm very excited about that. And you've teed me up nicely with your transition from push, I'm going to publish, which what a lot of the thinking was doing. I'm going to publish my pages. I'm going to publish my knowledge. I'm going to publish my messages or my materials, to how can I help you? How can I understand you better, rather than what I want to say, what do you want to hear? And what is going to be valuable, so that we're having a conversation about something that's going to move this discussion along to somewhere that benefits both the person who has the content and the person who wants the content. Which tees me up nicely to say that's why Larry Swanson is now our latest member of the Urbina Consulting team. Yay, Larry.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so and I think that it has to do with that philosophical alignment. We're really excited about this idea of building these relationships through content that supports a dialogue. How do you, rather than say, how do I get my stuff out there? How do I understand what the market needs and understand how to build content services which are well designed for the requirements that the market has? It's a different mentality, and I think a mentality of the future, which takes us to this idea of modeled content and headless CMS. So Larry and I were about to kick off a big modeling project for a household name, which we can't talk about yet, but you guaranteed all know them and grew up with them in your house. Big, publisher. And they're in the classic situation, a lot of headless CMS projects these days. We're gonna consolidate the zillion CMSs that we're running around in the enterprise to one headless uniform. Sorry, not Uniform, the company. One uniform, because there's a company called Uniform. One consistent headless CMS in the background, and we're going to move everything in there. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to kick around the topic of modeling, but also what are the challenges and opportunities that are related to content modeling in a headless project, because that's something that we're hearing so much about these days. We're going to move headless. We want to move headless. How do we go headless? And the two of us who have been doing decoupled and headless, our whole careers, to talk about today with the current crop of headless systems, which are very popular. And there's like a handful of names that are kind of becoming the new darling children of the headless market. Everyone's kind of talking about moving in this direction, but there's a lot of issues there and not a lot of experience in those issues. So I wanted to kind of start out. What are the kind of the potential gotchas? What do people have to think about when they're moving to headless?
Yeah, I think the first one is like, again, being old, I remember the rise of desktop publishing, and this is back a publishing metaphor that you could just publish whatever you wanted. You didn't have to have an editor or a publisher, all those things. I think it's equally important now, just as like we lost sight of the roles that were involved in creating a publication. there's a lot of roles involved in orchestrating this new environment of like really truly decoupled content that's all about more back to the purpose of the content, the like typically actually I want to do a quick aside. I just want to say real quickly, you inspired a thought in me that like the tools that we need, the foundational intellectual and standards-based tools that can guide a lot of this, whether you actually adopt the particular standards. But like the DITA standard that arose like about 15-20 years ago, to topically structure content, and then the semantic web standards, OWL and RDF, and these are both W3C standards that kind of give you a way to think about how to structure stuff and ascribe meaning to it and put it back together in different ways. Again, whether you use specific standards and technologies, I think the knowledge about how to do this that comes out of our kinds of heads has been ensconced, in places that we can draw on. So I like our odds, as we tackle projects like this. We have some good models and skills to draw on, but there's still a lot of challenges there. And I'll just kind of from beginning to end, like there are going to be authoring challenges. Authors are used to like WordPress and Squarespace and Wix and WYSIWYG tools to just that where you're
or Microsoft Word or Google Docs.
Exactly, yeah, Word or any of those where what you see is what you get, and that's not going to be true in headless decoupled architectures. So there's that. There's going to be the management of the content itself. I think in those systems, you're going to be agglomerating. I think you could have, I don't know exactly, but in projects like this, you might take stuff that was previously done in social media channels, in email, and on the website, and in the apps, and maybe not, it doesn't all go in one place, but a lot of that stuff will be kind of reorganized by purpose and intent in a management system. So just the way you think about a content management system and how you as an administrator of that system work, that's going to change. And then the front end, I mean, we've been dealing with this for a few years now. Everything, it kind of started with the responsive web and, just style sheets that could help you adapt to different things. But now that's just gone on steroids, with the need as the output of that content management system. Now, instead of just templatized web pages or docs or something, you're going to be pushing out APIs that a web developer, an app developer, a kiosk person, a print publisher might be drawing on. So I think there's challenges across the spectrum. But again, like I said, there's standards and knowledge and lore in place. I like our odds of being able to tackle this.
I think so. I think there's a lot there, and I'm gonna keep track of your acronym dropping, so we make sure. I know we have a diverse audience out there. I'm gonna go back in order. So when we talk about understanding and having things to look at, you mentioned DITA and RDF. These are two standards for how you can structure your content. They have different focuses. DITA is more about how you actually author it in like reusable modules, how you mark it up, etc. And RDF is more about how you make relationships between those modules. So if I'm making a product and a product has features, and a product has add-ons, and a product has related products, it might have parts and spares, or it might have markets or particular applications, all these relationships between different ideas. That's more on the RDF side. But the reason I'm very careful about dropping these acronyms is because when you Google this stuff, it's incomprehensible to the average content professional, and definitely to the average team leader or middle or definitely senior executive. It's just gobbledygook. So although there's the knowledge out there, it's very frustrating. Well, it's good if you're a consultant like us, but I'm kind of putting myself in our audience's shoes and going, it's very frustrating because it's very hard to look this stuff up. It exists, but the resources are not designed for the people who have to get it done. They're designed for the technical people who will help them get it done. The same thing I think applies for headless. If you're looking for headless CMSs, it's a very developer-oriented product set right now. So my big issue with the headless tools that I'm seeing, and I think they're pretty open about this, and they know that they're kind of made for the IT departments right now, is that they're just not nice or clear or easy to adopt for the actual users. So the business end of the project. When you're going to one of these projects, you kind of have to, if you're coming from any of the simpler CMSs that were, you just create pages and you create pages and folders, and those folders are the navigation on the website. Then, or you tag thing and it goes to a certain spot on the website. If you're from that world, headless is a lot of free fall. There's a feeling of, wow, where'd all my stuff go? And how am I supposed to, like, what am I looking at here? What I see in a headless CMS, I'll give a concrete example. So I'm working with modeling content, and we were doing this at the university, and we were teaching the kids how to model recipes, which is a classic. Some people who are old content modeling people in the audience will be groaning. It's a classic thing to model. Modeling, because you've got kind of the description part of the recipe, a little bit of maybe some kind of written paragraph stuff, maybe could be quite long form, like if people start waffling on about this was my grandmother's recipe and she gave it to me on her deathbed, and then you get into the actual ingredients part, which is very structured, because you have each ingredient and it has its amount and it has its, how do you separate like a handful of a pinch of salt versus 8 grams of pepper, etc. All the different ways you might represent the ingredients. But then that's a very structured reference table. And then you have the instructional part. And like, how do you write good instructions and make sure they're clear and unambiguous? And how do you want to add media or notes to each instruction? So it's actually a very interesting example. And what we found was, we're trying to do this in a headless CMS, and there was not a very good vocabulary of how we could do content types. Everything in the CMS was a content type, everything. And so you kind of ended up authoring in a sort of snail shell, where you're going, I want to create a recipe. A recipe has an ingredient. An ingredient has its quantity, the ingredient itself, like pepper, salt, onions, and then the quantity of what. So if we have three kilos, 3 grams, 3 pinches, etc. And what we found was that every single recipe, all of the ingredients in the recipe became their own objects, their own content types. Not just pepper, but 1 pinch of pepper. And then if I have another recipe, I would have 2 pinches of pepper. And then if another recipe is half a pinch of pepper. So I end up with like all these thousands of objects. They don't really make any sense, just kind of cluttering up my CMS. And it's very weird. It's a very weird way of authoring, because then when I say, if I want to reuse something, I have this enormous list of every possible permutation of how much pepper. And it's saying, do you want to point to one of those? I'm like, I don't know. If in this list of 10,000 objects, is somebody else already said 1 pinch of pepper? And so the whole idea of these systems is reuse. But actually, some of these new systems which are being coming out here, yeah, they can do reuse, and we are implementing them and we do consult on them. But you have to kind of know how to design these systems in a way that's going to be effective, so that the reuse actually happens. That, for me, that's one of our big challenges. Is we're buying the idea of reuse and single source and omni-channel, but making that happen in these systems is not trivial. You have to have a very well thought out model to do that, to make your system navigable and viewable.
Yeah, you're reminding me, I'm still sorting out in my head the relationship between content modeling and information architecture. But a lot of what you're talking about, there's like a huge, obviously, interplay and overlap between those, because that notion of like, and right in between the two of those, I would put a metadata strategy. But like a lot of what you're talking about is like, what do you have? You have these things. Oh, some of these things are potentially ingredients, and in terms of like, you can have a metadata strategy both about how you identify that thing in your own system, like a taxonomical way of talking about the things you have, and then the kind of property-based metadata about like, oh, and this is a thing for sweetness or savoriness or ethnic recipes of various kinds or whatever. So yeah, there's I like our odds, because I think metadata strategy is much more sophisticated and developed these days. I think largely, not entirely due, but I think practices like knowledge graph ontologies and things like that help inform that. But we've all been doing, again, I think back to my information architecture practice 20 years ago, you're doing the exact same thing, just modeling, figuring out what the entities are, what are their attributes, how do you represent them technically, and then build it. That's,
Yeah, no, I've always I talk a lot about models versus domain models versus ontologies versus knowledge graphs. I leave information architecture out most of the time because it's almost too confusing. And we probably should talk about that. What is the difference between taxonomy and especially navigation taxonomies, like categorizing your stuff for how you're going to sort it, and how you're going to display it so people can navigate it, versus content modeling? Like, what is the difference between content modeling and information architecture? It's one of the few kind of disambiguations which I've kind of avoided. I avoid talking about, not intentionally. This is interesting. So feel free to have
well,
crack.
I did,
How do you differentiate them?
well, I made an attempt a while back because I identify, I really identify now as a service designer with an omnichannel focus. But what I call myself among content friends is a content architect. And what I did is I mapped all these things we do as content people to Jesse James Garrett's, that old map of the levels of UX: strategy, scope, structure, skeleton, surface. And the way I mapped, and this is kind of ham-handed and sort of clickbaity, I guess, but basically I matched, content strategy to the strategy layer. Those line up perfectly. I map modeling to the scope layer, where you're going to figure out what do you got, what do your domain modeling, your content modeling, all that stuff that happens there. I map information architecture to that structure level, where you're sorting out the Lego box and how you label it and which colors go with which and all that structure. So I put information architecture at the structure layer. It gets a little fuzzier at the top, like the difference between content design and UX writing. I don't know that the profession has sorted that out entirely.
No, that's a mess.
And the roles are often conflated. But those top two layers of I think the second layer is clearly about information design, as opposed to presentation level design. That's sort of the distinction between the skeleton and the surface. And so I kind of map content design to the skeleton, like the scaffolding that that you hang your content on in the interface, and then I line up UX writing to that. So that's one.
But where's information architecture in there? Because I use content modeling to refer to what you said for information architecture and content modeling, which is what are the things that we're going to be talking about, which it starts with generally understanding the subject domain. You can start with a domain model, and going, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about wine. Wines have regions and grapes and particular brands and wineries. So those are the things we're going to talk about. What are we going to say about them? Well, wines have years, and wines have particular brand names, and wines have awards. They have regional recognition certificates, and blah, 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 blah. So that detail of what are we going to say about this stuff? How do we want to say it? And also, when you put a year, do you type, you put in a number, and if you put in a number in words, like if you write in 1995, the system's going to reject it. It will only take a four-digit year. That specification of how we want to receive the content. I refer to all of that as content modeling. Information architecture, in the parlance that I'm used to using it, has to do a lot with navigation architecture. How am I going to categorize this? When we come to whatever it is, the site, the watch, the chatbot, what is the architecture of how you can move, maybe chatbot's not the same. Yeah, it's conversation design. The organization of these things that we're writing about, because that could be very different depending on what touch point we're talking about. So in a headless system, we may present and organize these things under a very different navigation and categorization system for one market or one application or one audience, but it's the same information or some slice of the same information. But then another touch point might have a completely different navigation architecture and categorization system. So I refer to those as the information architecture. Yeah. Content modeling for me is the back end stuff that says this is how we do all of our content, for example, in a headless CMS. And then on the different heads, you might have different information architectures. And this is the interesting thing. Like, we work together, and when you get into the nitty gritty, we don't even have, no one has alignment on all these definitions. I've never met two people who are like, yeah, okay, we see all the things the same way.
Well, this is also why we have job security, because nobody agrees on this terminology, and half of the job of a consultant is getting people to agree on terminology. So we got to do that ourselves. Got to eat our own dog food, as they say. But I think we're aligned on, like, the general idea of how we think about it. We just have to tidy up how we label things. One thing I've seen, a number of folks have attempted to simplify that 5-layer model, and I've seen other, like, enterprise architecture models that people have tried to tidy things up, and a couple of them leap to mind. Beth Dunn did it for in her book
Sorry,
on
what was the
cultivating.
name? Beth Dunn?
Beth Dunn wrote a book
Beth
called
Dunn.
Cultivating Content Design. I
Mhm.
can't remember exactly how she sorted it out, but basically it was 3 layers of, like, strategy, structure, and surface. Something, I think that was how she simplified it. But more germane maybe to our work is the guys, Factor Firm, Bram Wessel and Gary Carlson in Seattle. They have this model that they show for they're like an information architecture consultancy, but I can't remember exactly how they identify it, but they have this 3-level enterprise architecture model. It's like systems, information stuff, application stuff, like kind of bottom to top, back end to front end. And I think that aligns really well with, like, my service design mentality about front of stage, back stage services underlying it. It also kind of gives you buckets where I think we could put everything we're talking about, information architecture and content modeling, in that middle layer, with some of it kind of like the navigation stuff migrating into that top layer of the application level, but also a lot of the taxonomy and ontology stuff going down to the systems layer. But it's that, and I think that's the point of their model, is that, like, that's the thing that ties it all together, is that information layer in the middle. And that's where all of this stuff rests, I think, that we're talking about.
Yeah, I've got to quote one of our clients at IKEA. So there's and she was also on our podcast herself recently, which was Timmy. Timmy from IKEA. What's Timmy's last name?
Akala, what's her last name? I forget. It's a hyphenated last name. Yeah.
She's gonna kill me. Yeah. Timmy Stoop Alcala. So Timmy came out with I think it's her term, but she's one of her first who shared it with me, which I love, which is the content stack. In the idea that, your whole content strategy comes in these layers of how you organize it, structure it. You have the actual layers of standards. I used to talk about, like, the standards pyramid, where we had, like, enterprise-wide standards. There's certain conventions and rules that go across the whole enterprise of how you do content, not just how you present the logo and what colors, but how you, like, for example, certain language standards. You have certain tone of voice standards, which might be company-wide. You might have certain terms that you use and don't use company-wide. Others will be functional. And so you have a layer, so that you have the kind of departmental layer saying, okay, well, within support, we can say this, but we wouldn't say it that way in marketing. And so on till you get down to stuff which you define for an individual project, which is, I'm going to create new content for this purpose, which no one has ever talked about before in the company. And it's ultra unique, but it's all based on this whole pyramid of standards. And so we're talking about the content models and taxonomies and all that stuff living somewhere in that pyramid. So coming back to recommendations, like, if you're going to a headless CMS, you need to be thinking about this pyramid of however you label the layers. Start to think in this layered separation of concerns that we have to be implementing. We have to be thinking about how we're going to tag things. What is the relationship between those things that we're tagging? So I gave the example of wines, a grape and a year and a vintage. Like, where does the price live? Maybe the price lives in a whole different system than the content. So how are we going to manage those relationships between the price data and the actual stuff we write about the products? And this is true for all industries. Like, it's this separation of concerns of they may not be in the same system. And I think headless CMS is doing it's done I'll call it a mistake. Headless CMS is kind of making the same mistake as AI companies are making, that companies have been making my whole career, which is that each one that shows up goes, I am the new single source of truth. I am the way. I am the one path. Now you can put everything in me, and all your problems will go away. And we've heard this story every decade, since I got into this game, and surely since you did too. You're going to have your headless CMS, but you're still going to have other content sources. There's other things in your strategy like pricing data, like support knowledge bases, like whatever, etc. Unstructured stuff like, oh God, save you if you're using SharePoint. There's going to be libraries of stuff all over the place, and you have to have this layer cake of standards saying, okay, we're gonna have a categorization system which we're going to agree across these departments, and occasionally maybe you might get to a point where you can say, okay, enterprise wide. Then content models. How realistic is it for me to do an enterprise content model? For example, Bruce Saunders, who is part of our panel of experts that we're doing as part of the same series on content modeling, talks about introducing the master content model. So if you look for Cruce, CRUCE, Saunders, introducing the master content model, then he's talking about this idea of we have a master content model, but then we have more specialized derivations of that for different purposes within the business. So this kind of layer cake thinking, I think, is the fundamental takeaway from this bit of the discussion, that you have to you have to not swallow the pill of, oh, I'm going to get a headless CMS. Now I have one CMS for all my things, and everything else can just, I'm done. And then we just raise for very important, and this is coming up again and again, the design of the information within a head is a separate concern, but related to the design of the information in the headless back end. Like, if I'm going to display it in these ways on this touch point, that information has to be available on the back end. So although we are separating concerns and we are going to this kind of neutral omni-channel resource, you have to know what you're trying to do with the experience you're trying to deliver, and the delivery layer. So if you're not in control of all that within your company, you have to be having an active dialogue. Yeah. The next big, I want to come up with the next big challenge, which I have an issue with, which is this situation where the IT department or some enterprise central function has said, okay, we're all standardizing on X headless CMS. What do you do if you already have a really good system in place? You have structure, you've done a lot of work, it's very well built. The argument, like, what do you do if you want to maintain, or you own the pricing system, for example, you own the PIM system, you have a structured system, and now you have this headless CMS movement in the organization. Now, navigating that discussion.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I kind of dealt with that a little bit. I was on one of my last things. One of my gigs last year was at Expedia, and one of the things that there was worked on an enterprise-wide CMS planning group, which was, they've got some content there. Let me tell you, like literally tens of petabytes of data about every airplane seat in the world. But I think that kind of gets back to the foundational meaning of that separation of concerns. Like it was early days when I looked at it. I have no idea where that project went. But one of the things we talked about was one CMS, which might make sense. Maybe not, though. That like one of the things that the separation of concerns may be that like this kind of CMS is really good for this family of stuff. And we don't want to just do our taxonomy and ontology stuff in the CMS. We want to sort that out as like something we do in Top Grade or Pool Party or something like that.
An external taxonomy dedicated system that is a service to the other systems.
Exactly. And I think in an omnichannel environment, I bet my prediction is we're going to see a lot more of that, because all that stuff you were talking about at the very start about the need to align different siloed organization, entities in the organization on terminology. Boy, good luck doing that anywhere, but you at least have a chance, if you're doing it, if you have like a person who's doing their best to align people across the org on stuff. And it can just be as simple as saying like, hey, I heard these people in customer support talking this way about this thing, and over in sales, they're talking about this way, and in customer support, they're talking about it. Help me reconcile this. And again, back, I won't repeat the acronyms, but there are technologies and standards that help you organize and align similar terms that mean the same thing. Kind of back to that Google notion of things, not strings. You're talking about the same thing, but you just have given it different labels in different contexts. It's kind of like what anthropologists or sociologists call a boundary object. You have a rock sitting in the middle of the table, and for the warrior culture, that's like, yeah, that's how you kill people. And for the farming people, they're like, no, that's how you plow the ground. So that's a boundary. And so they call it a killing machine over there and a hoe over there, but it's still the same thing. And so I think we have a similar thing in enterprise. content management, that you're going to have things kind of hovering in the organization that people call different things. And there are both procedural, like you can get people in a workshop and help them, agree on terminology. And if you can't, when there may be good reasons to call things different things in different contexts, then you have some kind of technical mechanism to align, say, like, oh, when they say this, it's the same thing as this they're saying over here.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the taxonomy being a separate concern and even a separate system is really, really, really important and powerful. So, we come back to the AI thing. If your AI is being trained on your content within your enterprise, if you have a universal taxonomy that at least it can get some tagging and get some understanding of relationships that is concrete. So it's not trying to just interpret this by reading your words, but you say, no, this is a product. It's a drug. It's for this market. It's for, it's not for pregnant women. Like if you have certain clear labels on your stuff, which is absolutely reliable, and that is present across connecting multiple silos, then an AI or a human being is going to have a much better chance of understanding that and connecting the breadcrumbs. I think that that's another kind of got you that we need to tell our listeners about. Taxonomy. It's not all of these headless CMSs do taxonomy at all. Some of them have plugins that do it. Some of them don't. So how are you going to how are you going to categorize things? How are you going to filter things? I see, if we're going to talk a little bit, I think for the last little bit, because we're probably coming out on time soon, I see that we're going to see a future of tools that are layers on top of your headless CMS. What I'm seeing right now with these headless CMS is you can go in, you can do your content model, you can author your content, but that's not really what they're good at. And I see a future where we have heads within the business that are for internal use that make the headless CMS usable. And that might be very different depending on what your needs are with that headless CMS. So you could have an authoring layer, and we've actually done this in some projects already, where you have like you have content creation, where you do go in the headless CMS and you create your objects and you relate them, etc. And then we have kind of a lower level of content creation where we've created a website where you can come in and put together Lego pieces and customize them and rename the groups and reorganize them, but you never have to log into the headless CMS. You are creating objects in the CMS, so you're creating new collections, you're creating new organizational structures, but you don't create the raw objects. You can put on like notes on things, but your job is not to be a content creator. So you are, as far as you're concerned, you are creating content because you're taking stuff for a particular purpose, putting together the Lego bits that you want, giving it new names, giving it a new presentation navigation, and then delivering it out to the market. So that, but on steroids, so that you could have completely different authoring tools, ways of authoring, and different interfaces for different parts of the business, but all facing back to this common back end. I really see that as a potential thing.
Yeah, I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago, a CMS vendor here in the Netherlands, about consumptive AI versus generative AI. And my idea is like consumptive AI, and I don't know if that's a real term, but that's what I was calling it, that notion of curation, like using AI, machine learning technologies to help with curation and reusing existing. It totally is tied into this whole structured content, headlessly, metadata strategied stuff, being able to do more with it. And that's, for lack of a better word, I came up with that consumptive AI, that like you're just consuming stuff you've already created. I think all the fuss now is about creating content with AI, but I think there may be, as you just said, I think there may be as many opportunities to reuse old stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's, so one of the more mature applications of AI is to categorize, read, summarize, auto tag, to read everything and say, where are you talking about what? What are the potential terms that you should be having in your dictionary, in your taxonomy of terms? And then I think summarization is one of the most interesting things when you think about it in your content model. So we have I haven't seen this yet. I've told this for a few vendors, and I should probably get paid for it because they were very excited about the idea. Um, but when you combine generative AI and consumptive AI, in terms of a content model. So I have got a content model that says I've got uh, products, and then I've got podcasts. So, and then a podcast or a product they both have social posts about them. And they might have email newsletter entries about them. They might have whatever other things in my content model that are about products and podcasts. So can I specify that if I write the long description of a product or the long description of a podcast, I want you to generate me the one line summary that's supposed to appear on the widget in my on my website, like on the landing page where I've got all the episodes of my podcasts, or the catalog page that has all my products. There's going to be like a one sentence description or two sentence description for like a LinkedIn post, or like a one paragraph description for a LinkedIn post. So I think there's this huge opportunity with headless and AI to say, over here, I've got one incarnation of the description, and elsewhere in my content model, it may be in this content type and maybe in other content types, I have other incarnations. So a way to specify to the headless CMS, look, here's the long one, give me the short one. Or if I write a short one, explode it out by consuming the other things I have in my business and writing me a long one. I think that's a huge opportunity, which we're not seeing implemented in any of the systems yet. We're bringing these two worlds together.
That's brilliant. And I think that reminds me of my very first publishing lesson back in the Flatiron Building in New York City many years ago. My boss wrote this really long memo to me. She used that old, now everybody's heard this, I apologize for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one.
Yeah, I think that's a quote from somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think it's, anyhow, I forget the exact source, but basically that idea that like, you've
Oscar
already
Wilde,
done,
I think.
yeah, somebody like that, yeah. But you've done the hard work of getting everything there. And these tools like AI are so good at summarizing it. Like what would take you 3 hours, it can do in 30 seconds. You're like, that's a win. I'll take it. So
yeah,
if you can ensconce that in a workflow, holy cow.
Yeah, 30 seconds plus 2 minutes of review and wordsmithing.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think that's an important point, that what they call in some junctures the human in the loop, to have like human oversight, especially like, well, I know you're doing stuff in pharma these days, and boy, you're not going to be shipping like raw AI generated content in that world, I'm sure. So, but and whatever it is, but you can also picture, like when you were talking before about like having your own enterprise corpus of your own stuff, that learning loop, I bet gets really faster and tighter when you're working with your own content, and the learning can be ensconced in the systems that much quicker, I think.
Yeah, well, that's what our big enterprise clients, they're looking at training their own large language models. They're not going to just use ChatGPT like we do. They're going to train their own internal model on their own content. And so the more you can give it structure as a reliable back end, and you can point, different things and say, specify reliable structures, the more effective those internal AIs will become. AI is going to become this two quote. I don't remember who it is, but someone said that AI will be like spell check. Mm-hmm. People talk about, how am I going to use AI to do my X? AI will be integrated into all of our tools, so that whenever we hit file new or new X, there's going to be an AI contributor. I just saw that in one of those headless CMSs, when you're doing your content model, you can say AI generated content type, and you can say I'm creating a podcast overview object, and it will come up, and it came up with what it came up with. It came up with like episode number, guests, head, title, short description, blah, the basics. It's there for you. You have to do things like say, no, I want my guests to be a pointer to my person object, so that the guest is actually a human being, and that human being then has a first name, last name, headshot, etc. So you can do two AI models and then just explain to the AI, look, this guests thing for a podcast should actually point to this person object over here. You have to do that manually. But, every day we're seeing a new point in the workflow where AI is being embedded. So rather than thinking of AI being this thing that I use and then I go back to my regular tools, it's moving so fast that all of these tools are going to be embedding these things. And then can you, in an enterprise context, point these different tools to your one unified like body of knowledge? Or again, we're not going to have that either because we will never be one unified anything in a large enterprise. Can you federate it so that at least there's like a butler AI who knows how to talk to all the others and bring you back the right answer for what you're doing?
Yeah, as you talk about that, I'm thinking there's, for any practitioners who are listening, there's going to be a lot of new kinds of professional development as we go forward to understand these technologies and be able to use them. Like I had coffee with a friend in Amsterdam last week, and he was a poet in college, and then he became a content designer. He just learned Python so he could do AI better. So that's like maybe the extreme, from poetry to Python programming in a couple of years. That might be extreme, but I think the point there that like, being conversant with all these technologies and just so you can identify those opportunities, especially if you're doing any kind of enterprise UX or enterprise content stuff, to like all the stuff you just said is like gold. And I think we'll save millions of dollars. I don't know. It's not hard to picture good benefits.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm hoping for. All right, so I want to wrap up with a couple of Larry, you and me, we're available on LinkedIn, of course, and this will be going up on the Omnichannel X website as one of our podcast episodes. Do check out, if you're listening to this, the rest of the content modeling session series. So we have kind of these overarching, let's say, virtual events that collect podcasts and webinars. We have the content modeling experts panel, which is part of this same group, where we have Chris Saunders, who I've already mentioned, myself, Megan Casey, Carrie Hain, Jeff Eaton. So they're kind of a bit of a who's who in the content modeling world. I wanted to recommend a couple of articles if you're looking to learn more about content modeling. That this is all stuff written prior to the headless movement. The term headless is only about 5 years old. These are articles that go back, double that. And some of our work goes back, before we were even calling it content modeling, we were kind of conflating it with content strategy. So when I was doing this with Anne Rockley, and just after the .com boom in 2002, 2003, we didn't use the term content modeling. We just said it was part of your content strategy, was getting down into all these details. So the terminology is evolving, but these articles you can check out that will prepare you for your headless migration. So from Jeff Eaton, you can Google up "Battle for the Body Field." That's, for me, that was a seminal article. That was a kind of one of those kind of penny drop moments in terms of bringing this discussion to the world of the page-oriented world, the people, which is not where I come from. I come from the structure-oriented world. Carrie's got a content modeling guide. So if you look for Carrie Hain content modeling guide, you'll find her guide. Megan Casey's got a workshop up on our website, on the Omnichannel X website, which is part of the same series, called the content modeling, the translation layer between teams. That's free. If you register to watch that, you can sit for a whole workshop with Megan. We already mentioned Cruz's article, Introducing the Master Content Model. And Larry, you mentioned when we were talking earlier, Marcelo Lewin.
Yeah, Marcelo. Yeah, Marcelo runs a site called Headless Creator, and he does just this whole series of really good content on content modeling. It's more at the technical implementation level, like actually building the schemas for a CMS.
Mm-hmm.
But there's much more than that there as well. But I think it's just headlesscreator.com, and Marcelo's a really gifted interviewer, good guy, and just tons of good content on that website as well.
And you were just on this podcast.
Yeah, last Friday. Yeah, a week ago, we had a chat about authoring experiences in decoupled architectures, which was
exactly. I'm super passionate about that. And then other one I want to drop is, of course, Rachel Levinger. I think she's credited with the first kind of article that went viral on this topic in 2012. She wrote "Content Modeling: A Master Skill" on a list apart. And that was a good article. I used that I used one of her diagrams as a teaching aid. And I was always ribbing her because she wrote in one of her content types was I think a band page or something like that. And I always circle page and go, nah, I'm not talking about pages. But it's an excellent article. It's really, really great. Her along with Carrie and Jeff, they're really great at kind of making these things accessible for everybody and understandable.
Yeah.
So we'll put all those links in the session notes. Otherwise, Larry, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Thank you for joining us at Urbina Consulting, and thank you for our discussion today.
My pleasure, Noz. Always fun to talk to you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. This has been the Omnichannel Podcast with your host, Noz Urbina, founder of Urbina Consulting. Let us know on LinkedIn or Twitter what you liked from this episode, what you think we missed, and who you would like us to interview next. Now that you've heard what we're passionate about, you can also check out urbinaconsulting.com to find out a little bit about what we do. Thank you so much, and see you next time.